The world has a way of reminding you that monsters don't always hide in abandoned houses or dark forests. Sometimes they wear expensive suits, drive luxury cars, smile politely, and shake your hand before quietly dismantling your life one piece at a time. About 5 years ago, I worked as a private investigator. Despite what movies would have you believe, there were no dramatic rooftop chases or secret gadgets. The job was painfully ordinary most days. Long hours parked inside an aging sedan, endless surveillance, taking photographs, writing reports that nobody except insurance companies and attorneys would ever read. Most assignments blurred together until they became impossible to distinguish from one another. But there was one case that never really left me. Not because it involved murder, not because it involved anything supernatural. It stayed with me because it demonstrated just how terrifying obsession can become when someone believes another human being belongs to them. To protect her identity, I'll call the woman Sue. When I first met Sue, she didn't seem like someone who needed rescuing. She was confident, intelligent, incredibly driven, and had built a rapidly expanding business almost entirely through determination. She had started with practically nothing, no wealthy family, no powerful connections, just a dream that refused to die. Watching people like her succeed always impressed me. She had convinced several investors to believe in that dream. One of them was a man named Steve. According to Sue, Steve had insisted on investing from the very beginning. She refused, not because she didn't need the money, but because Steve wasn't just another investor. He was a friend. Years earlier, Sue had worked as a bartender while trying to save enough money to start her own company. Steve had been one of the regular customers. Nobody really knew exactly what Steve did for a living. He carried himself like someone who never had to worry about money. He drove a pristine Corvette. Every suit looked custom-tailored. His watches probably cost more than most people made in several months. Whenever the group went out for drinks, Steve always reached for the bill before anyone else could. He had the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Over months of conversation, Sue told him about her dream, her business, her plans, her fears. Every single night, Steve made the same offer. "Let me invest." Every single night. She said no. Again, and again, and again, until reality cornered her. Her business began running out of money. Other investors hesitated. Bills piled higher every week. Dreams don't disappear overnight. They slowly suffocate under unpaid invoices. Eventually, with almost no options remaining, Sue accepted Steve's offer. She believed she was borrowing money from someone she trusted. She couldn't have known she had unknowingly signed herself into something far more dangerous than debt. The change was immediate. It wasn't gradual. It was as if the moment the money transferred into her account, Steve decided he owned part of her life. Then he started calling, constantly. Morning, afternoon, middle of the night. Sometimes 20, 30, even 40 missed calls would appear on her phone before breakfast. If she ignored him for an hour, another barrage of messages would arrive. "Where are you? Who are you with? Why aren't you answering? Call me. Now, immediately." Sue showed me hundreds of saved messages. Not dozens, hundreds. Looking through them felt less like reading conversations and more like examining evidence collected from someone descending into obsession. At first, the messages sounded concerned, then demanding, then manipulative, then openly cruel. The psychological pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't communication. It was conditioning. Every unanswered message became another excuse for punishment. Every moment of independence became an act of betrayal in Steve's mind. People often ask why victims don't simply block someone. The answer is almost never simple. Sue felt guilty. She had accepted his money. She believed she somehow owed him patience, understanding, gratitude. That guilt became the very weapon Steve used against her. Whenever she tried creating distance, he reminded her exactly how much he had invested. It wasn't business anymore. It was control. Then things escalated. Sue eventually started seeing someone new. She hoped having a normal relationship would help her move on from months of emotional abuse. Instead, it became another target. One evening, she met a man she'd been dating for dinner and drinks. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. Just two people enjoying each other's company. Then, Steve appeared. Nobody had invited him. Nobody even knew he was nearby. According to Sue, he had somehow followed them to the bar. She still had no idea how he always seemed to know where she was. The night remained relatively calm until the man casually wrapped an arm around Sue. That single gesture seemed to ignite something inside Steve. He walked directly across the room. Didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't threaten. He simply threw one punch. A devastating punch. The man collapsed unconscious before anyone fully understood what had happened. The entire bar froze. Glasses stopped clinking. Music continued playing while everyone stared in stunned silence. Somehow, no charges were ever filed. Sue believed Steve's wealth and influence protected him. Whether that was true or not, the result was exactly the same. He walked away, and she became even more terrified. The physical violence was frightening, but what happened afterward was worse. Much worse. She began feeling watched. Every night she heard footsteps outside her apartment, slow measured, never rushing. Sometimes the footsteps would circle her bedroom window. Sometimes they would stop directly beneath it. Then nothing. She would hold her breath for several minutes waiting for another sound. Silence. Complete silence. Was someone actually outside? Or had months of psychological torment rewired her brain into expecting danger everywhere? That uncertainty became its own prison. Because once fear enters your routine, every sound becomes evidence. Every shadow becomes a person. Every parked vehicle becomes surveillance. Sue became convinced she kept seeing Steve's distinctive red pickup truck. Different grocery stores, different intersections, outside restaurants, near her office. Sometimes she would notice it parked several blocks away. Other times it disappeared the instant she tried getting a better look. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. That's the cruel thing about stalking. Eventually, reality and paranoia become impossible to separate. Your brain stops asking whether someone is following you. Instead, it starts asking why they haven't appeared yet. She stopped dating, stopped going out, stopped trusting strangers. Even success no longer felt rewarding because she believed someone was always watching from just beyond sight. Then, without warning, everything stopped. No phone calls, no messages, no footsteps, no truck, no surprise appearances, no threats, nothing. It was as if Steve had simply vanished from the face of the earth. At first, Sue refused to believe it. She expected him to reappear at any moment. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Slowly, the tension began leaving her body. She slept through entire nights. She laughed again. She dated again. Eventually, her company exploded in popularity. The business she'd sacrificed everything to build became wildly successful. She moved into a beautiful new home and finally allowed herself to believe the nightmare was over. Ironically, success reminded her of Steve. Not because she missed him. Far from it. She wanted freedom. Complete freedom. She decided she would repay every dollar he had ever invested. Every cent. She wanted nothing tying her life to his ever again. It sounded simple enough. Find Steve. Write the check. Close the final chapter. Except Steve had disappeared so completely that it almost seemed impossible he had ever existed. His phone number had been disconnected. Every email bounced back. No Facebook. No Instagram. No LinkedIn. Nothing. It was as though someone had erased his digital footprint with surgical precision. She even returned to the bar where they'd first met. The bartenders who remembered Steve looked genuinely confused. One shrugged. Another frowned for several seconds before quietly saying, "I haven't seen him in years." No one knew where he'd gone. No one knew whether he had moved. No one knew if he was even alive. The man who had once inserted himself into every corner of Sue's life had disappeared so completely that it felt less like someone moving away, and more like someone had simply ceased to exist. For nearly 3 years, it seemed as though Steve had simply disappeared. No phone calls, no messages, no unexplained sightings, no red pickup truck, nothing. Eventually, even the deepest fears begin to dull. The human mind cannot stay trapped in a constant state of panic forever. It adapts. It convinces itself the nightmare is over. Sue finally allowed herself to believe that whatever obsession had consumed Steve had burned itself out. She was wrong. It happened on an ordinary weeknight. The kind of quiet night where every house on the street had already gone dark. Just after midnight, she was startled awake by a sound that instantly froze every muscle in her body. 3 slow knocks. Knock. 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 Not loud. Not frantic. Just deliberate, patient. As if whoever stood outside already knew she was awake. Sue lay perfectly still, hoping she had imagined it. Then the knocking came again. Exactly the same rhythm. Slow measured. Almost polite. Her heart pounded so violently, she later told me she thought whoever was outside could probably hear it through the walls. She quietly slipped out of bed and crept toward the small window beside her front door. Every step felt impossibly loud. She barely lifted the edge of the curtain. Standing on her porch, completely motionless, was a tall figure wearing a dark hood. No movement, no pacing, no attempt to force entry. The figure simply stood there, watching the house. His face was swallowed by darkness. She couldn't make out his eyes. She couldn't even tell if he was looking directly at the window, yet every instinct in her body screamed the same name. Steve. She had absolutely no proof, no face, no voice, no identifying features, only a feeling. Sometimes instinct notices details long before the conscious mind does. The figure raised one hand and knocked again. 3 slow knocks, then silence. Sue didn't breathe, didn't speak, didn't move. For nearly 20 minutes, the hooded stranger remained exactly where he was, almost unnaturally still. Then, without warning, he slowly turned, walked off the porch, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the streetlights. The next morning she called me. Her voice was different than before. When we had first met, she'd sounded exhausted. Now she sounded defeated. She told me everything from the beginning. Every phone call, every threat, every sleepless night, every strange vehicle she'd convinced herself she imagined. And finally, the hooded visitor. She wasn't asking me to scare him away. She wasn't asking for revenge. She wanted closure. She wanted to find Steve, hand him every dollar he had invested in her company, erase the final connection between them, and never think about him again. At first, it sounded like a straightforward investigation. It wasn't. The deeper I dug, the stranger everything became. The first surprise came almost immediately. Steve wasn't actually Steve. The name he'd given everyone, including Sue, was completely false. Then, another discovery. His address wasn't real anymore. His phone records ended years earlier. Employment history, nearly non-existent. Bank records were almost impossible to trace. Even stranger, I discovered similar reports in neighboring towns. Different women, different names, different identities. The pattern repeated itself with disturbing consistency. He would arrive in town appearing wealthy. Luxury vehicles, expensive clothing, generous spending. He would carefully earn trust, then fixate on a woman, offer financial help, slowly blur the line between generosity and ownership. It was emotional predation disguised as kindness. Yet every trail I followed ended at exactly the same point. Over 2 years earlier, after his final contact with Sue, he had vanished. Every alias disappeared. Every rental property had been abandoned. Every phone disconnected. Every trace simply ended. People don't usually disappear that completely, not unless they desperately want to, or unless something happened to them. Weeks into my investigation, I had almost accepted that finding him might be impossible. Then Sue called me again. This time, she was crying. The man is back. I drove to her house immediately. By the time I arrived, the porch was empty. No footprints. No vehicle. No witnesses. Nothing. Only Sue, terrified, standing behind a locked door. I searched the neighborhood for nearly an hour. There were patches of dense woodland surrounding the back of her property. The darkness beneath those trees seemed almost unnatural. Whoever had been standing on her porch had vanished without leaving the slightest clue. That bothered me. A lot. I decided not to leave. Instead, I parked across from Sue's house and began watching every night, hour after hour. Nothing happened. Until the 4th night, at exactly 2:03 a.m., the motion sensor light above Sue's porch switched on. A hooded figure silently climbed the front steps. Then 3 slow knocks. The exact same rhythm. I threw open my car door and shouted. The figure immediately turned. For the first time, I caught a glimpse beneath the hood. Not enough to identify him, only enough to see wild, frightened eyes. Then he ran. Not toward the road, not toward nearby houses, straight into the woods. I chased him. Branches whipped across my face. Dead leaves exploded beneath our feet. The forest swallowed almost every sound except our breathing. For several minutes, I managed to keep him in sight. Then he simply disappeared. 1 second he was there. The next, nothing. No footsteps. No snapping branches. No movement. It was as though the woods themselves had swallowed him. I returned to Sue's house. She was shaking uncontrollably. I insisted she spend the next few nights with relatives while I continued investigating. As soon as daylight broke, I returned alone. The forest looked completely different in sunlight, less frightening, but somehow more unsettling, because now I could clearly see just how many places someone could hide. I searched methodically. Broken branches, flattened grass, discarded food wrappers. Eventually, I noticed a narrow path almost invisible beneath thick undergrowth. It led deeper into the trees. After several hundred yards, I found it. Calling it a cabin would be generous. It was little more than a crude wooden shack hidden beneath overgrown branches. It blended so perfectly with the surrounding forest that I could have walked within 10 feet of it and never noticed. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it open slowly. The smell hit me immediately. It was overwhelming. Rotting food, sweat, mold, old garbage. The stale odor of someone who had lived in isolation for far too long. The shack was empty, at least, empty of people. Scattered everywhere were crushed beer cans, soda bottles, spoiled food containers, filthy blankets, and piles of garbage. Someone had clearly been living there for quite some time. Then I noticed something in the far corner. A wheelchair, sitting perfectly upright, facing the doorway. At first I thought someone was sitting in it. My pulse nearly stopped. Then I realized it wasn't a person. It was a life-size mannequin. Its plastic face had been damaged by repeated blows. One side of its head was cracked. Its lips were smeared with thick makeup. A cheap blonde wig had been carefully placed on its head. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it resemble a woman. My stomach tightened. Then I looked into its lap. There was an old photograph. Sue, standing beside Steve years earlier while she still worked behind the bar. The realization struck me instantly. This wasn't decoration. This mannequin was supposed to be her. It wasn't just obsession anymore. It was ritual, fantasy, an entire imagined relationship preserved inside a rotting shack hidden in the woods. Every instinct I had told me to get out. Instead, I immediately called the police, gave them my exact location, and explained everything I'd found. Within minutes, officers surrounded the area. We waited quietly outside the shack. No one spoke. The woods seemed impossibly still. Then, footsteps. Slow, careful, approaching through the trees. The hooded man emerged carrying a plastic grocery bag. He walked straight into the shack. Before anyone moved, we heard him speaking, softly, patiently, as though comforting another person. He was talking to the mannequin. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them stepped forward and announced their presence. The reaction was immediate. The man exploded into a violent rage. He lunged toward one of the officers with terrifying speed, screaming incoherently as if they had interrupted something sacred. Several officers wrestled him to the ground before finally restraining him. When they removed the hood, Sue had been right all along. It was Steve, or whatever his real name actually was. Investigators never determined exactly how long he had been living inside those woods. Weeks, months, possibly years. Long enough to construct an entire fantasy world centered around a woman who had spent years believing she had finally escaped him. Looking back on that investigation, what disturbed me most wasn't the hidden shack. It wasn't the mannequin. It wasn't even the years of stalking. It was something far simpler. Night after night. He never tried to force the door open. He never broke a window. He never shouted. He simply stood outside, knocking, waiting, patiently, as if he genuinely believed that sooner or later, Sue would finally decide to let him in. And sometimes when I think about that case, I can't help wondering how many nights he had been standing outside that house, without anyone ever noticing he was there. To this day, the part of that investigation that haunts me the most isn't what we found inside the shack. It isn't the mannequin. It isn't the years of stalking. It's the questions that were never answered. No one could explain where Steve had disappeared to for those missing years. No one could explain how a man who had once flaunted expensive cars, designer suits, and endless cash ended up surviving inside a rotting shack hidden deep in the woods. His financial records simply stopped. His identities vanished one after another. Every alias became a dead end. When officers finally arrested him, the person they carried out of those woods barely resembled the polished businessman Sue had once trusted. He looked hollow. His clothes hung loosely from his body. His beard had grown wild and uneven. His eyes carried the vacant, distant stare of someone who had been living inside a fantasy for far too long. It was as though the man everyone had known years earlier had slowly disappeared, leaving behind nothing but an obsession wearing human skin. Sometimes I wonder whether Steve had always been that person, or whether obsession gradually transformed him into something unrecognizable. I honestly don't know which possibility is more frightening. I lost contact with Sue not long after the arrest. Part of me hopes she eventually found peace. But trauma doesn't disappear the moment the danger is removed. The police can arrest a stalker. They can't arrest the memories. For months, maybe years. Every unexpected knock at the door probably made her heart race. Every unfamiliar vehicle parked outside likely demanded a second look. That's the cruel thing about fear. Long after the threat is gone, your mind continues searching for it. Cases like hers taught me an important lesson. The people who destroy lives rarely look like monsters. Sometimes they arrive smiling. Sometimes they offer help. Sometimes they convince you they're your closest friend. And sometimes, by the time you realize what they truly are, they've already found a permanent place inside your nightmares. If there's one flaw I've carried through most of my life, it's this. I've always been far too easy to influence. Some people naturally question everything they're told. I've never been one of those people. When enough voices pushed me in one direction, I'd eventually convince myself they had to be right. Looking back, that weakness got me into more trouble than I care to admit. When I was a teenager, someone dared me to steal my principal's car. Not damage it, not prank it, actually steal it. For reasons I still struggle to understand, I accepted. The plan failed spectacularly. I was expelled from school. At the time, I laughed it off as another stupid teenage mistake. Years later, I realized nothing had really changed. The consequences had simply become much bigger. This happened several years ago, shortly after I became engaged. From the outside, everything looked perfect. We had plans. A future. A wedding. A life together. Then one tiny thought entered my mind. What if she's cheating? It wasn't based on evidence. Not a suspicious message. Not unexplained absences. Not strange behavior. Nothing. Just a feeling. A single thought. Unfortunately, fear has a terrible habit of growing whenever it's fed. Instead of talking to my fiancé like any reasonable adult would have done, I made an enormous mistake. I shared those fears with friends. I expected someone to tell me I was overthinking. Instead, nearly all of them said the same thing. If you're feeling it, there has to be a reason. Trust your instincts. Those words dug into my mind like splinters. Suddenly, every late reply became suspicious. Every smile at her phone became evidence. Every delayed trip home became another imaginary piece of a puzzle that probably didn't even exist. Within days, I was barely functioning. I couldn't concentrate at work. Food lost its taste. Sleep became impossible. Every night I lay awake imagining conversations and betrayals that may never have happened. Looking back now, I realize something terrifying. Paranoia doesn't require proof. It only requires repetition. Tell yourself the same frightening story often enough, and eventually your brain accepts it as reality. Then one friend offered what he described as the perfect solution. Hire a private investigator. I actually laughed. Private investigators existed in detective movies. They wore tailored suits, carried cameras with massive lenses, followed suspects through crowded cities. At least that's what I believed. The idea sounded absurd, until my anxiety convinced me it wasn't. Instead of having one honest conversation with the woman I loved, I opened my laptop. That single decision changed everything. I searched online for private investigators. Almost immediately, I ran into another problem. I wasn't even sure whether hiring someone to secretly follow another person was legal. For reasons I still can't explain, I ended up searching Craigslist. Yes, Craigslist. Even typing those words now makes me cringe. If there were legitimate investigators, surely they wouldn't advertise there. But anxiety doesn't make logical decisions. It only demands action. After scrolling through dozens of questionable listings, I found one person operating nearby. His name was Shane. At least, that's the name he gave me. We exchanged several messages before agreeing to meet the following afternoon. He chose the location, a quiet public park only a few minutes from my house. Even before leaving home, I felt something was wrong. Not just nervous, uneasy. The kind of uneasiness that sits deep in your stomach without offering any explanation. Still, I went. The park was nearly empty when I arrived. Children had already gone home. The playground stood silent. The wind pushed dead leaves across the walking paths. I wandered around for almost half an hour. No Shane. I sent him several messages. No reply. For a brief moment, I considered leaving. Then my phone vibrated. A single message. Come to the large oak tree. No greeting. No apology. Just an instruction. I walked toward the tree expecting someone who looked vaguely like the detectives I'd seen in movies. Instead, I found a tall, slightly overweight man wearing faded sweatpants, an oversized hoodie, and sneakers that looked as though they'd survived several years of construction work. There was no briefcase, no camera bag, no professional equipment, nothing. I actually looked around him, assuming I had the wrong person. Then he smiled, lifted one hand, and waved me over. You're looking for Shane. It wasn't a question. Before I could respond, he shook my hand with surprising confidence. Then he gestured toward the woman standing beside him. This is my girlfriend, Gabby. He explained that they worked together. Apparently, she helped him with surveillance jobs. The explanation should have reassured me. Instead, it somehow made everything feel stranger. Gabby looked even less professional than Shane. Neither of them resembled investigators. They looked like two people who had wandered into the park by accident. I must have been staring because Shane suddenly laughed. "You expected suits, didn't you?" I admitted that maybe I had. He grinned. "The best investigators never look like investigators." He pointed toward his old sweatpants. "This is camouflage. If we look ordinary, no one notices us." Oddly enough, it made sense. At least it did at the time. Fear has an incredible ability to make ridiculous explanations sound perfectly reasonable. The three of us sat down at an old wooden picnic table beneath the trees. Shane pulled out a small notebook. Everything seemed normal again. At first, he asked for my full name, my address, my workplace, daily schedule, vehicle information, the places my fiancé and I usually visited, standard questions, questions I expected. Then the interview slowly changed. Without warning, the questions became strangely personal. Not professionally personal, personally personal. Questions about my childhood, my sleeping habits, whether I lived alone before getting engaged, whether anyone else had keys to my house, how often I locked my doors, whether I had security cameras, what side of the bed I slept on, how long my fiancé stayed home when I was at work. He asked about valuables inside my house, family members, neighbors, vacation plans, the layout of my home, the location of every entrance. By the time he finished, I realized something deeply unsettling. Very little of what he'd asked had anything to do with proving whether someone was cheating. Instead, it sounded disturbingly similar to someone trying to learn exactly how vulnerable I was. Looking back now, I can identify dozens of moments when I should have walked away. The problem with fear is that it doesn't always make you run. Sometimes, it convinces you to keep moving forward. Every strange decision suddenly feels reasonable because your mind becomes obsessed with reaching the answer you've convinced yourself you need. So when Shane's questions became increasingly personal, I answered every single one. Without hesitation, without thinking, I told myself this was simply how private investigators worked. After all, I'd never hired one before. How was I supposed to know what was normal? He scribbled notes while nodding occasionally, never appearing surprised by any answer I gave. When he finally closed his notebook, he quoted his price, half up front. The remainder after he delivered what he promised would be conclusive evidence. He insisted on one condition: cash, no checks, no electronic transfers, no receipts. "It's easier this way," he said with a casual shrug. "Off the books." That explanation should have sent me home immediately. Instead, I reached into my wallet. Even as I counted the bills into his hand, something inside me refused to settle. It wasn't just nervousness anymore. It felt heavier than that, like some primitive instinct trying desperately to pull me backward. For just a second, I almost changed my mind. Then Shane smiled, folded the money into his pocket, and assured me I'd hear from him soon. We shook hands. Gabby smiled politely, and they walked away. That should have been the last time I ever saw either of them. Instead, it was only the beginning. A full week passed. Nothing. No updates. No photographs. No phone calls. No emails. Complete silence. I sent several polite messages asking if there had been any progress. No response. Eventually, those messages became less polite. Still, nothing. The silence itself became unsettling. At first, I thought they were simply busy. Then I wondered whether they'd forgotten about me. Finally, I accepted what should have been obvious from the start. I'd been scammed. Oddly enough, once I accepted that possibility, I actually felt relieved. Losing the money hurt. But maybe it was better than discovering my fiancé had actually been unfaithful. I tried convincing myself to let it go. Then, at exactly 1:16 inches the morning, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I opened the message. It was Shane, or at least someone claiming to be him. The message was strangely brief. "I had to get a new phone. Sorry for disappearing. I have information you need to hear immediately. Meet me now. It can't wait until morning." I stared at the screen. None of it made sense. My fiancée was asleep beside me. She had spent almost the entire day with me. There had been no mysterious disappearances, no suspicious behavior, nothing. I replied almost immediately. "Can this wait until tomorrow?" His response appeared less than 10 seconds later. "No morning will be too late." Those words unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Too late. For what? I asked again. What happened? No answer. Instead, Another message appeared. An address. Hurry. Then one final reminder. Don't forget the rest of the payment. Even now, I struggle to explain why I went. Logic had already left the conversation hours earlier. Fear was making every decision for me. At that point in my life, I worked a job that required me to be on call 24 hours a day. Leaving in the middle of the night wouldn't seem unusual if my fiancé woke up. That tiny justification was all I needed. I quietly climbed out of bed, got dressed, grabbed my wallet, slipped out the front door without making a sound. The address Shane had sent was only about 10 minutes away. It felt much longer. Every traffic light seemed to last forever. Every mile gave my imagination more opportunities to invent horrible possibilities. Maybe he'd caught her with someone. Maybe there were photographs. Maybe everything I'd feared was true. By the time I reached the address, my hands were trembling against the steering wheel. Then I saw the house. Something felt wrong immediately. No porch light. No lights inside. No nearby cars. No sounds. The entire property looked abandoned. The yard was overgrown. Several windows were covered with cracked plywood. Paint peeled from the siding in long strips. The place looked less like an office, and more like somewhere people avoided. I checked the address again. It matched perfectly. I remained inside my car for several minutes, hoping someone would eventually come outside. Nobody did. I texted Shane. No reply. I called. Straight to voicemail. Silence. Finally, my phone buzzed. One message. Only 2 words. Doors open. I stared at the screen, then back at the house. I replied, I think I'm at the wrong place. A response arrived almost instantly. You're here. Just come inside. I typed back again. Can you meet me outside? Several seconds passed. Then, no. The front door isn't locked. Come in. Even remembering those messages today makes my stomach tighten. Every instinct told me to leave. Every survival alarm in my body was screaming. Yet somehow, I still climbed out of the car. The night was strangely quiet. No insects. No distant traffic. Even the winds seemed to have disappeared. As I walked toward the front porch, each wooden step groaned beneath my feet. I reached for the doorknob. It turned immediately, unlocked, exactly as Shane had promised. I pushed the door open. Darkness. Complete darkness. The air inside carried the stale smell of dust, mildew, and old wood. It didn't smell like an office. It smelled like a building that hadn't been lived in for years. Hello. My voice echoed through the empty rooms. Nothing. I tried again. Shane. Silence. No footsteps. No movement. No voices. Just the hollow echo of my own words disappearing deeper into the house. I had already decided to leave. I literally turned toward the front door. Then my phone vibrated again. Another message. I heard you upstairs. Sorry. Forgot to tell you. Our office is in the basement. Then another. Door on the far left. Come downstairs. I slowly looked across the room. There it was. A single door, half hidden in the shadows. Something about it instantly filled me with dread. The hallway leading toward it felt unnaturally dark. Each step sounded far louder than it should have. The old floor creaked beneath my weight as though the house itself were protesting my presence. When I reached the basement door, I rested one hand on the knob. It felt cold, almost damp. I slowly opened it. The hinges let out a long, agonizing groan. Beyond the doorway, nothing. Only a staircase descending into absolute blackness. No lights, no voices, no office, no furniture. No indication that another human being was anywhere below. It looked less like a basement and more like a hole cut into the earth. The kind of darkness that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. I stood frozen at the top of those stairs. Every warning sign I'd ignored replayed through my head all at once. The Craigslist advertisement, the fake professionalism, the strange questions, the cash payments, the disappearing phone number, the abandoned house, the unlocked front door. Every single decision had brought me exactly here, standing alone, inside a deserted building, staring into a basement where absolutely nothing waited except darkness. Then my phone buzzed again. I looked down. Are you coming down? A few seconds later, another message appeared. Or are you planning to stand there all night? The words hit me like ice water. Whoever had sent that message knew exactly where I was. They could see me, but I couldn't see them. That realization shattered whatever denial I still had. This wasn't an office. There never had been an office. I wasn't meeting a private investigator. I had walked directly into someone else's trap. For the first time that entire night, I listened to the voice inside my head. Without replying, without making another sound, I slowly backed away from the basement door. Every movement felt painfully loud. I expected someone to rush up those stairs at any second. Nothing happened. I reached the front entrance, stepped outside, closed the door as quietly as possible. The instant I reached my car, I locked every door before even starting the engine. As I sped away from the house, I actually wondered if I had overreacted. Maybe Shane really was downstairs. Maybe I had let my imagination get the better of me. I desperately wanted to believe that. Then my phone buzzed one last time. One final message appeared on the screen, and the moment I read it, every remaining doubt disappeared. I didn't discover the final message until I was already several miles away. My hands were still shaking as I pulled into an empty gas station to catch my breath. Only then did I unlock my phone. One unread text. No name, no explanation. Just 6 words. Good for you, buddy. Take care now. That was it. No threats. No insults. No attempt to lure me back. Just those 6 strangely calm words. Oddly enough, they terrified me far more than any obvious threat could have. It sounded almost disappointed, like someone watching prey escape a trap they had spent a long time preparing. I sat in my car reading those words over and over again. The more I looked at them, the more sinister they became. Good for you. As though someone had been testing me. Take care now. As though they knew we'd never meet again. Or perhaps they already knew exactly where to find me if they wanted to. The following morning, I called the number repeatedly. Every attempt failed. The line no longer existed. It had vanished overnight. I drove back to Craigslist hoping to gather something, anything that might identify Shane or Gabby. Their advertisement had disappeared completely. No profile. No listing. No contact information. Nothing. It was as though the two of them had never existed. The realization hit me all at once. They hadn't simply stolen my money. Money was probably never the real objective. If all they'd wanted was cash, they already had it. There would have been no reason to contact me again. No reason to lure me to an abandoned house in the middle of the night. No reason to insist I walk alone into a pitch-black basement. Whatever had been waiting downstairs, it almost certainly wasn't a private investigation. To this day, I still don't know what their plan actually was. Kidnapping, robbery, extortion, something even worse. Sometimes the unknown is more frightening than the truth, because your imagination rarely shows mercy. For months afterward, I barely slept. Every creak of the house jolted me awake. Every pair of headlights slowing outside made my pulse race. Every unexpected knock at the front door felt like the beginning of another nightmare. The worst part wasn't wondering whether Shane knew where I lived. I already knew he did. I'd handed him that information myself, freely, without hesitation. He knew my address. He knew where I worked. He knew my schedule. He knew when my fiancée would probably be home alone. Every piece of information he needed, I had willingly placed into his notebook. The guilt was unbearable. Eventually, my fiancée couldn't ignore the change in me anymore. I had become withdrawn, distracted, constantly checking windows, double-locking doors, looking over my shoulder in grocery stores. She finally sat me down and asked what was happening. I told her everything. Everything. Hiring the investigator, believing she was cheating, meeting strangers from Craigslist, driving to the abandoned house, the basement, the messages, the panic, the shame. Watching the hurt spread across her face remains one of the hardest memories I've ever carried. She wasn't angry because I'd almost been scammed. She was hurt because I had allowed fear and the opinions of other people to outweigh my trust in her. Thankfully, she listened. She reassured me she had never been unfaithful. More importantly, she didn't walk away. Instead, we spent months rebuilding something I should never have questioned in the first place: trust. Not long afterward, we moved into a different house. The day we changed addresses felt strangely symbolic. For the first time in months, I could finally breathe. The constant fear slowly faded. Looking back, I know exactly what I should have done. I should have gone to the police. I should have reported every message, every phone number, every detail. Instead, I convinced myself it was over. I swallowed the financial loss, accepted my own stupidity, and tried to pretend none of it had ever happened. Maybe that was the wrong decision. Maybe someone else eventually answered another one of Shane's advertisements. Maybe another frightened person climbed those same basement stairs. I'll never know. What I do know is this: sometimes surviving means recognizing danger 1 second before it's too late. That night, I was lucky enough to listen to the voice telling me to leave. One more text message. One more step down those stairs, and I honestly don't know whether I'd be here telling this story today. Even years later, I still catch myself wondering what waited in the darkness beneath that abandoned house. Perhaps it's better that I never found out. If you lived through 2020, you probably remember how strange the world suddenly became. Entire cities grew quiet, highways emptied, restaurants closed, people disappeared behind locked doors. For many, it was a lonely year. For me, it became something much worse. Only a few weeks before the shutdowns began, I had accepted a new job nearly 8 hours away from my hometown. I barely had enough time to unpack before everything changed. Almost overnight, the city transformed into a ghost town. The streets became eerily silent. Neighbors stopped speaking. Everyone seemed afraid of everyone else. Being isolated in an unfamiliar city is unsettling enough. Doing it during one of the strangest periods in recent history made the loneliness almost unbearable. Months passed with little more than work, television, and empty evenings. Eventually, I realized something. If I stayed locked inside forever, loneliness was going to become its own kind of prison. So I downloaded a few dating apps. Not because I was desperately searching for love. Honestly, I just wanted to remember what normal conversations felt like. Maybe meet someone for coffee. Maybe make a friend. Anything that reminded me there were still real people beyond my apartment walls. Over the next several months, I met a handful of different men. Every date was perfectly ordinary. Some were kind. Some were funny. Some simply weren't compatible. There were no disasters, no dramatic endings. Just polite conversations followed by mutual silence. Then I met Wade. On paper, he was almost too perfect. Attractive, confident, intelligent, quick-witted. He knew exactly what to say. He remembered tiny details from previous conversations. He laughed at the right moments. He opened doors, paid for dinner, asked thoughtful questions. If someone described the ideal first date, they would probably describe Wade. And yet, from the very first meeting, something deep inside me refused to relax. I couldn't explain it. There were no obvious warning signs. Nothing he said was inappropriate. Nothing he did crossed a line. But there was something about the way he looked at people, too focused, too intense, almost as though he wasn't listening to conversations. He was studying them, watching, analyzing, waiting. People often dismiss instincts because they can't be measured. I've learned they deserve far more respect than we give them. Years earlier, I had ignored every instinct warning me not to enter that abandoned house. I promised myself I would never make that mistake again. So despite Wade checking every imaginable box, I refused to force feelings that simply weren't there. Still, I gave it an honest chance. We went on several more dates, dinner, walks, movies, coffee. Nothing terrible happened, but nothing ever felt natural either. Every conversation felt rehearsed. Every smile seemed just slightly delayed. Every compliment sounded perfectly constructed rather than sincere. It wasn't frightening. Not exactly. It was simply off. Eventually, our conversations became shorter. Replies took longer. Plans quietly stopped being made. Without any arguments or dramatic confrontation, whatever existed between us simply faded away. At least, that's what I believed. Life finally began feeling normal again. I made friends through work, explored the city, stopped opening dating apps altogether. Then a few weeks later, I noticed the SUV, gray dark tinted windows, parked across the street from my house. The first night I barely acknowledged it. Someone had to live nearby. The second night, it was parked in almost exactly the same place. The third, again. Soon I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The SUV hadn't become familiar because I'd seen it around the neighborhood. It had become familiar because it appeared almost every evening, always nearby, always quiet, always impossible to see inside. I tried convincing myself one of my neighbors had simply purchased a new vehicle, so I casually began paying attention to every driveway along my street. Nothing. No gray SUV. No unfamiliar residents. No visitors staying overnight. Yet somehow, the vehicle kept returning, night after night, always there, always watching. At least, that's what it began to feel like. A week later, I drove to the grocery store after work. The parking lot was crowded. People hurried between cars carrying bags. Shopping carts rattled across the pavement. Everything looked perfectly normal. Then that familiar sensation crept over me. The unmistakable feeling that someone was following just a few steps behind. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing unusual. Families, employees, other shoppers. No one stood out. Still, The feeling refused to disappear. I finished shopping much faster than I normally would. When I pushed my cart toward my car, my heart nearly skipped a beat. Parked directly beside me was a gray SUV, dark-tinted windows, the same color, the same shape, the same unsettling silence. Coincidence? Probably. At least that's what I desperately wanted to believe. I loaded my groceries into the trunk as quickly as possible, climbed into my car, locked the doors, and pulled away. As I drove toward the exit, I happened to glance toward the front entrance of the store. That's when I saw him. A tall man, perfectly still. Dark sunglasses despite the fading evening light. His hair neatly slicked straight back. He wasn't shopping. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He wasn't looking around. He simply stood there, his head angled toward my vehicle, so motionless that for one chilling second, it felt less like he was watching my car, and more like he had been waiting for it to leave. By the time I left the grocery store, I was trying desperately to convince myself that everything I'd experienced had been nothing more than coincidence. The gray SUV, the man with the slick back hair, the feeling of being watched. All of it could be explained away, at least. That's what I kept repeating to myself. The human mind desperately searches for ordinary explanations because the alternative is almost impossible to live with. Unfortunately, fear doesn't disappear simply because you refuse to acknowledge it. It waits, quietly, patiently. Then it returns when you least expect it. I refused to let those thoughts ruin my evening. I had plans. For the first time in weeks, I was actually looking forward to something. I had agreed to meet a man named Paul for coffee. It would be my first date since things quietly faded with Wade. I remember telling myself that this was exactly what I needed. A fresh start. A normal conversation. Proof that not every new person in my life came with hidden warning signs. The coffee shop was warm and inviting. The smell of freshly ground coffee filled the room. Soft music played through hidden speakers. Rain tapped gently against the windows. It felt safe. Paul was already waiting when I arrived. Within minutes, I realized how comfortable he made me feel. He was funny without trying too hard. Intelligent without sounding arrogant. The conversation flowed naturally. There were no awkward silences, no forced smiles, no rehearsed compliments. For the first time since moving to this city, I relaxed, completely. I actually caught myself smiling, laughing, enjoying another person's company. It was the first genuine spark I'd felt on any date since downloading those dating apps. For a little while, I forgot about the SUV, forgot about the strange man, forgot about everything. Then, I happened to glance toward the window. My smile disappeared instantly. Across the street, parked beneath a dying maple tree, sat the same gray SUV. Exactly the same color, exactly the same dark-tinted windows. It wasn't moving. It didn't need to. Simply seeing it was enough to make every muscle in my body tighten. Paul immediately noticed the change. "Are you okay?" His voice sounded distant. I barely heard him. Instead, my eyes scanned every table inside the coffee shop, every booth, every corner, every face. Then near the entrance, I found him, the tall man, the same neatly combed slick back hair, the same dark sunglasses. Even though we were indoors, he sat alone at a corner table. His phone rested casually in his hands. To anyone else, he looked like another customer waiting for coffee. But every few moments, his head tilted ever so slightly in my direction. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to convince me I wasn't imagining it anymore. This wasn't coincidence. Coincidences happen once, maybe twice. Not over and over again. The realization settled over me like ice water. Someone was following me. The terrifying part wasn't simply knowing someone was watching. It was not knowing why. Had I done something? Did they mistake me for someone else? Was I in danger? Or was I slowly losing my grip on reality? Fear rarely gives you answers. It only asks better questions. Paul continued watching me with obvious concern. I could have told him everything. The SUV, the grocery store, the strange feeling. Instead, I lead. I forced a smile and apologized. I completely forgot about something for work. The words sounded weak even to me. Paul looked disappointed, but he nodded. "No problem. We can do this again." His kindness somehow made me feel even worse. I hated lying to him, especially because for the first time in months I genuinely wanted another date. Still, telling someone you've only just met that an unknown man may be stalking you isn't exactly the easiest conversation to begin. We hugged goodbye. I walked quickly to my car. Then, Instead of driving directly home, I deliberately took several unfamiliar roads, left turns, right turns, residential streets, anything to determine whether someone was following me. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then I looked into my rearview mirror. There it was, the gray SUV, maintaining a careful distance, never speeding up, never falling too far behind, always there, watching, following. I felt every drop of blood leave my face. I made another unexpected turn. So did the SUV. Another. Again. It followed. At that point, I stopped trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I drove aimlessly through town for nearly 20 minutes before finally noticing the SUV disappear several intersections behind me. I never saw where it turned. One moment it occupied my mirror. The next, it was simply gone. I waited several more minutes before cautiously driving home. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Eventually, I decided Paul deserved an explanation. I sent him a long message apologizing for leaving so abruptly. As I typed, I admitted more than I'd intended. Not everything, but enough. Enough to explain why I looked terrified. Paul responded almost immediately. His messages were calm, patient, understanding. He never once made me feel irrational. As I sat near my living room window reading his replies, something caught my eye. My fingers froze above the keyboard. Parked directly across from my house sat the gray SUV. Again, it wasn't hiding. It wasn't trying to blend in. It simply sat there, motionless, waiting. The curtains in my living room suddenly felt paper thin. Every room inside the house instantly seemed exposed. I hurried away from the window and called Paul. Within seconds, he answered. The moment I explained what I was seeing, his tone changed completely. "You need to call the police." Immediately, for once, I didn't argue. The officers arrived surprisingly fast. I watched everything from behind the curtains. 2 patrol cars pulled alongside the SUV. The tall man calmly stepped out. What happened next confused me more than anything else. He didn't argue, didn't run, didn't appear nervous. He greeted the officers almost professionally. They spoke quietly for several minutes. At one point, the man reached inside his coat. My heart nearly stopped. Instead of producing a weapon, he handed one of the officers what looked like an identification wallet. The officer studied it carefully, then nodded. Their conversation continued. Nobody appeared alarmed. Nobody reached for handcuffs. Nobody even raised their voices. A few minutes later, one officer walked toward my front door. When I answered, his expression was sympathetic. Not frightened. Not urgent. Sympathetic. He explained that the man outside was a licensed private investigator. Legally licensed. According to the investigator, he had been hired to conduct surveillance. I stared at the officer in complete disbelief. "As surveillance investigation. The officer nodded. I immediately asked the obvious question. Who hired him? He apologized. He couldn't tell me. Whether he genuinely didn't know or legally couldn't disclose it, I never found out. That answer somehow frightened me even more. Someone had spent money to secretly watch my life. Someone who apparently knew where I lived, where I shopped, who I met. Who was that person? I barely knew anyone in this city. The entire situation felt deeply violating, not just frightening. Personnel. After the officers left, I hurried outside, hoping to confront the investigator myself. The parking space was empty. The SUV had vanished. No goodbye. No explanation. Nothing. The following days were some of the longest of my life. The SUV never returned. Yet the feeling remained. Every time I left work, I checked every parked vehicle. Every reflective window became another opportunity to look behind me. Every stranger suddenly felt suspicious. The surveillance had ended, but the paranoia hadn't. The worst part wasn't even being followed. It was never learning why. Eventually, life slowly regained its rhythm. Paul and I continued seeing each other. Things felt surprisingly easy between us. Weeks later, we decided to spend an afternoon hiking through one of the beautiful state parks outside the city. Fresh air, quiet trails, towering trees. Exactly the kind of place where anxious thoughts are supposed to disappear. Instead, they returned almost immediately. From the moment we entered the trail, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was somewhere behind us. Not close enough to see, just close enough to feel. Every time leaves rustled, I turned. Nothing. Every snapping twig made me stop walking. Nothing. Eventually, I noticed something even more unsettling. Paul kept looking back too. He never said anything at first. but I caught him glancing over his shoulder over and over again. Finally, I laughed nervously. Maybe it's another private investigator. He smiled. I hope whoever hired the first one at least got their money's worth. We both laughed. It felt good. For a few moments, the tension disappeared. Then we reached the parking area. Paul excused himself to use the restroom before we left. I stood outside, scrolling through my phone. The parking lot was unusually quiet. Then I heard footsteps. Not walking. Running. Fast. Violently fast. I looked up. Bursting from the tree line came someone I recognized instantly. Wade. His face looked completely different than I remembered. His eyes were wide. His hair was disheveled. His breathing sounded frantic. He wasn't simply running. He was charging directly toward me. Before I could react, his hand clamped around my wrist with shocking force. His grip hurt immediately. "We're leaving." His voice wasn't angry. It was desperate, almost pleading. "We're leaving right now." I tried pulling away. His grip tightened. "You cheated on me," he shouted. "You made a mistake. I forgive you. You just have to come with me." My mind froze. Cheated. We had never even been in a relationship. We'd gone on only a handful of dates. Nothing more. His words made no sense. I screamed. The sound echoed across the parking lot. Within seconds, the restroom door burst open. Paul came sprinting toward us. Without hesitating, he slammed into Wade, knocking both of them onto the pavement. For one brief second, I thought it was over. Then Wade climbed back to his feet, his face twisted with fury. He pointed directly at Paul, then at me. The expression in his eyes no longer looked human. It looked like someone whose fantasy had just been destroyed. And people who believe their own fantasies can become terrifyingly unpredictable. For one terrifying moment, everything seemed suspended. The wind disappeared. The birds stopped singing. Even the sounds of the nearby parking lot seemed to fade into the distance. All I could hear was my own heartbeat. Wade stood only a few feet away, breathing heavily. His eyes never left mine. They weren't the eyes of someone who had simply been rejected after a few disappointing dates. They were the eyes of someone who had built an entire imaginary life inside his own mind and had become furious that reality refused to cooperate. Those kinds of delusions can be incredibly dangerous, because once someone genuinely believes a fantasy, they stop recognizing where fantasy ends and reality begins. Paul, however, never backed down. He didn't hesitate. He didn't panic. He simply stepped directly between Wade and me. Without saying a word, he made it absolutely clear that Wade wasn't getting any closer. For several agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Wade stared at Paul. Paul stared back. Neither man blinked. The silence felt almost unbearable. Then, something changed. The confidence Wade had displayed only moments earlier began to disappear. His breathing slowed. His shoulders lowered. Almost reluctantly, he took one small step backward, then another. His expression shifted from rage to something much colder. Calculation. It was as if he suddenly realized the fantasy he'd been clinging to had completely collapsed. Whatever he had planned, it wasn't going to happen anymore. Paul quietly grabbed my hand. "We're leaving." Those two words finally broke the paralysis that had taken hold of me. We ran. Neither of us looked back. Every footstep across the gravel parking lot sounded impossibly loud. I expected to feel Wade's hand grab my shoulder at any second. I expected to hear him running after us. I expected him to tackle us before we reached the car. Instead, there was only silence behind us. Paul unlocked his car. I climbed inside so quickly that I nearly slammed the door on my own leg. The instant the locks clicked shut, I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and called the police. Trying to explain what had just happened while fighting back tears wasn't easy. The dispatcher remained calm. "Patient." She assured us officers were on the way. By the time law enforcement arrived, Wade had already disappeared into the surrounding woods. It was as though the forest had swallowed him. Officers searched the trails for quite some time. Nothing. No sign of him. No vehicle. No witnesses who could clearly identify where he'd gone. I assumed that once I explained everything, Wade would immediately be arrested. Reality turned out to be much more frustrating. Legally, there wasn't much they could do, at least not yet. Without physical injuries, recorded threats, or stronger evidence, much of the incident became exactly what officers described as a classic case of conflicting statements. One person's word against another's. It felt unbelievably unfair. Someone had followed me, grabbed me, tried convincing me to leave with him. Yet somehow, that still wasn't enough. Ironically, the person who ultimately helped prove my story wasn't a witness. It wasn't Paul. It wasn't another hiker. It was the private investigator Wade himself had hired. The very man whose surveillance had terrified me for weeks unexpectedly became the key piece of the investigation. According to detectives, the investigator had originally accepted what appeared to be a routine surveillance assignment. Wade had reportedly claimed that I was his girlfriend, that he suspected I was secretly seeing someone else. Unfortunately, investigators hear stories like that all the time. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then things stopped making sense. As the investigator followed me over several days, he noticed obvious inconsistencies. There were no signs of a committed relationship, no shared home, no shared routines, no evidence suggesting Wade and I were ever romantically involved beyond a handful of casual dates. The deeper he looked, the stranger Wade's claims became. Eventually, even the investigator grew uncomfortable. He reportedly confronted Wade and suggested he stop pursuing me altogether. Whatever fantasy Wade had constructed, the investigator recognized it was becoming unhealthy, perhaps even dangerous. Wade ignored every warning. When detectives eventually contacted the investigator after the incident at the state park, he cooperated fully. He explained everything: the surveillance, the lies, his growing concerns about Wade's behavior. His testimony changed everything. For the first time, there was independent evidence supporting what I'd been trying to tell everyone, that someone had become dangerously obsessed with me, not because of anything I'd done, simply because I'd existed inside his imagination. Shortly afterward, I was finally granted a restraining order. Holding those papers in my hands should have made me feel safe. Instead, they felt strangely fragile. A restraining order is only effective against someone who still respects boundaries. The terrifying part about obsession is that it often destroys the very concept of boundaries. Fortunately, I never had to discover whether Wade intended to obey it. Not long after the legal proceedings ended, he disappeared. Completely. His social media accounts vanished almost overnight. Every profile was deleted. His phone number stopped working. Mutual acquaintances had no idea where he'd gone. It was almost as though he had erased himself from the world. Part of me desperately wanted to believe he had simply moved away, started over somewhere else, forgotten about me. Another part of me, the part trauma leaves behind, still isn't convinced. Years have passed. I haven't seen him again. I haven't received another message. No mysterious vehicles have appeared outside my home. No unexpected encounters. Nothing. Yet sometimes, when I catch someone looking at me a second longer than normal, or notice the same vehicle twice in one day, my mind quietly returns to that chapter of my life. Because fear has an extraordinary memory. What disturbs me most isn't what Wade actually did. It's how little it took. We weren't partners. We weren't living together. We weren't even officially dating. We had shared only a handful of ordinary evenings. A few conversations. A few dinners. Some polite goodbyes. That was enough for him to imagine an entire relationship that had never existed. Enough to hire someone to follow me. Enough to monitor where I lived. Enough to convince himself that another man had somehow stolen a future he believed already belonged to him. Obsession doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it begins quietly. A message. A compliment. A coincidence. An unexpected appearance. A smile that lasts just a little too long. Only later do those harmless moments reveal themselves as the opening chapters of something much darker. I think about one detail more than any other. If Paul hadn't walked out of that restroom when he did, if he had stayed inside for only another minute, I honestly don't know how that afternoon would have ended. Maybe Wade would eventually have let go. Maybe he wouldn't have. I'll never know. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part of all. Some of the most terrifying stories aren't frightening because of what happened. They're frightening because of what almost happened. Years later, I've rebuilt my life. I've learned to trust my instincts. I've learned that intuition often notices danger before logic can explain it. Most importantly, I've learned that sometimes the people who pose the greatest threat aren't strangers hiding in the shadows. They're ordinary faces you once shared coffee with. People who smiled across the table. People you believed you barely knew. And every now and then when I pass a gray SUV with heavily tinted windows parked quietly along an empty street, I still catch myself looking twice, just to make sure no one inside is looking back.